It happened in the middle of Gertrude's birthday lunch, in the backyard on Birchwood Drive, with half the neighborhood watching through the cedar fence. Preston pulled the white envelope out of his breast pocket and held it up like a piece of evidence. His voice was calm at first, that particular kind of calm that Joe had learned to dread over 11 years of marriage, the kind that meant something was coming, and the only question was how bad. "Tell me where this came from." Joe was standing at the folding table with a cake knife in her hand, halfway through slicing the birthday cake. She recognized the envelope immediately. She'd tucked it into the inner pocket of her winter coat 3 days ago, behind the lining where the pocket had come unstitched, the one place she'd thought Preston would never look. "It's from the Marchans," she said. "Next door. I sewed the bridesmaids' dresses for Isabel's wedding. 4 dresses, 3 weekends of work. You charged them money." They offered. "I didn't ask." "You charged our neighbors." His voice climbed steadily, like they were a client, like you were running some kind of business out of my house without telling me. People shifted in their lawn chairs. Gertrude set down her plastic cup. Callista, Preston's sister, pressed her lips together and studied the grass at her feet. "I spent more than 60 hours on those dresses," Joe said, keeping her voice even. "The thread and the zipper pulls alone. You embarrassed me." He crossed the yard in 3 quick steps and snatched the envelope from where he'd apparently found it in her coat. He'd been carrying it all afternoon, she realized now. All through the birthday lunch, through the speeches, through the singing, he'd been waiting for this moment, with exactly this audience. "Paul Marchand pulled me aside this morning to thank me for your generosity. He said you'd spent 3 weekends on his daughter's dresses." I stood there like an idiot who didn't even know what his wife was doing in his own house. "Do you have any idea how that looked? You're upset because your neighbor thanked you. Don't." His voice dropped to something quiet and sharp. "Don't do that." "Preston, I worked. They paid me. That's not embarrassing." The sound was very clean and very sudden, like a hand hitting a table, except it wasn't the table. Joe's palm flew to her cheek. The cake knife clattered against the folding table. Around the yard, not a single person moved. Not one voice rose. There was only a brief collective intake of breath, the sound of 20 adults making a shared decision to be somewhere else in their minds, and then everything went quiet. Millie was standing at the back door of the house in her purple hoodie. She was 9 years old. She'd been carrying a paper plate with a piece of birthday cake on it. Now she stood absolutely still, staring at her father with an expression that Joe did not let herself fully look at, because if she looked at her daughter's face right now, she would come apart, and she could not afford to come apart. For $350. That was how much it had come to. But standing in that backyard with her face burning and her daughter watching from the doorway, Joe understood something she hadn't fully let herself understand before. It had never been about the money. It had never been about the Marchands, or the envelope, or the hours she'd spent in the spare bedroom while Preston watched television downstairs. It was about the fact that she had done something without asking him first. That was the only thing Preston Holt had ever truly been unable to forgive. Joe's mother had called her a natural the first time she sat down at the old singer in their house in Trenton. She was 11 years old, and she'd watched her mother thread the needle exactly once, and then she'd threaded it herself, picked up the pattern, and simply begun, with a patience and precision that didn't look like something that needed to be taught. By 17, she was altering prom dresses out of her parents' basement for $20 apiece, and turning down work she didn't have time for. By 19, she'd saved enough money to get herself to Toronto, had the letter of acceptance from Ryerson's fashion program, and had packed a single duffel bag that was sitting by the front door on a Thursday morning when Preston Holt showed up in his truck and offered to drive her to the bus station. She never made it to Toronto that day, or the next, or the one after. Preston was 25 and handsome, in the effortless way of men who had always been told they were. He talked with a confidence she had mistaken, at 19, for wisdom. He said Toronto was expensive. He said Ryerson was a gamble. He said he'd known women who gave up everything chasing something like fashion and ended up alone with nothing to show for it. And he loved her too much to watch that happen to her. He said it gently, as if it were a favor he was doing. He said it while holding both her hands in his. She called Ryerson and deferred. 1 year became 2. Then she was pregnant with Millie, and the conversation simply stopped coming up, the way a door quietly closes without anyone touching it. She still sewed. She sewed in the spare bedroom on a secondhand machine she'd found at a garage sale in Napanee, after they moved there for Preston's work. She did alterations mostly. Took in waists, replaced broken zippers, hemmed things people brought her in paper bags and grocery sacks. She charged very little and always checked with Preston first, because the money went into the joint account, and Preston reviewed the joint account every Sunday night over tea, with the same careful attention he gave everything that passed through his hands. The $350 from the Marchands was different. She'd asked Isabel to bring it in cash, in an envelope, and not to mention it to anyone. It was for Millie. Millie's class was going to Quebec City in March. $185 plus spending money. Joe had been trying for weeks to figure out how to ask Preston for it. Every conversation circled the same way they all did, narrowing carefully until she was out of room, and she had run out of time before she ever ran out of attempts. She hadn't told anyone that part, not even Rosanna. Her sister arrived that same weekend, driving up from Ottawa in her silver Civic, with a bag of groceries she'd picked up at a health food store on Bank Street because she knew what Joe kept in the pantry. They were standing in the kitchen putting things away when Rosanna went quiet. Joe knew that quiet. It had a particular shape. "Let me see." "It's fine, Ro." "Joe, let me see." Rosanna set down a spada and reached out with two fingers very carefully and tilted her sister's face toward the kitchen light. She didn't say anything for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly level, which was more frightening than if she'd raised it. "How long has this been happening?" "It was one." "That's not what I asked." Joe set down the can she was holding. She tried to think of a beginning and found there wasn't a clear one. There was a bowl thrown against the wall when Millie was 2. There was a grip on her arm that lasted in yellow and purple for 11 days. There were the times that weren't quite hitting, but close enough that she'd learned to flinch at fast movements. And the times that were exactly what they were, and after each one, she'd told herself this was the last time, and kept telling herself that right through 11 years. "I don't know where it starts," she said. The honesty of that answer frightened her more than anything else would have. Rosanna pulled out a chair. Joe sat down across from her. They stayed like that for a while without talking, the pasta still on the counter and the groceries half put away. And outside the kitchen window, Napanee went about it Saturday afternoon, as if nothing had happened in the yard on Birchwood Drive the day before. Gertrude came over that afternoon. She sat in the armchair in the living room, with her tea held in both hands, and her cardigan buttoned to the throat, and she said, in the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this on the drive over, "Preston has always had a temper. His father was exactly the same way. Some men are built that way. You know that going in." Joe sat across from her and said nothing. "These things are private," Gertrude continued. "Family matters. The neighbors don't need to be involved. Once people start talking, you can't take that back." "He hit her in front of the neighbors," Rosanna said from the doorway. Gertrude's chin lifted. "Now I didn't. I'm looking at the bruise on her face right now, so let's not go around it. I didn't come here to be spoken to like that. And Joe didn't do anything to deserve what happened." Rosanna's voice was entirely quiet, but we seemed to keep having to say that part out loud. Gertrude left shortly after without finishing her tea. That evening, Callista sent a text, measured and careful, the words of someone crafting a message they could deny being unkind later. She hoped things would settle. She understood Preston was under a lot of pressure at work. She hoped Joe could find a way to see his perspective. Joe read the message. She thought about the yard on Birchwood Drive, 20 adults, and not one of them moved. She thought about Callista looking at the grass. She thought about every neighbor who had murmured their way back to their lawn chairs, every relative who had found a reason to look somewhere else. And now they were each finding a way to contact her privately about perspective. She set the phone face down on the bathroom counter and did not pick it up again that night. She had understood Preston's perspective for 11 years. She could have written it out from memory. She knew every turn of it. The following Saturday, she accepted a commission from Diane Herman, whose daughter was getting married in June. A mother of the bride dress, ivory with cap sleeves, structured through the bodice, with the kind of seam work that takes real skill to do properly. Joe said yes without asking first. She laid the fabric out on the kitchen table, Saturday morning, and Millie sat at the other end, doing her homework with a cup of hot chocolate and a pencil tucked behind her ear, and for a few hours the kitchen felt like it belonged to them. Preston came home at 3 in the afternoon. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table. "What is this?" "A commission," Joe said. She kept her hands moving on the fabric. Diane Herman from Millie's school. She needs a dress for her daughter's wedding in June. You don't have a business. I'm doing a job. He said it again, very slowly, as if she hadn't understood him. You don't have a business. We've talked about this. You sew out of my house. You use my heat and my electricity. And if you want to start charging people money, you talk to me first. That's how this works. I worked. They're paying me. That's how work works. Millie, Joe's voice came out very steady. Go upstairs, please. Millie looked at her mother, then at her father. She picked up her hot chocolate and her pencil and walked upstairs without argument, without a word, because she had learned, in the quiet way children absorb things they shouldn't have to absorb, exactly what that tone of voice preceded. What happened after Millie went upstairs went on for a while. By the time Rosanna called at 9 that night, Joe was sitting on the bathroom floor with her back against the side of the tub, and when she answered, her own voice surprised her. How flat it sounded, how far away. Ro, she said, I need you to come back. Rosanna was there by 10 the next morning. She let herself in with the key Joe had given her 6 years ago and never asked back. She walked into the kitchen and took one look and did not say any of the things she might have said. Instead, she said very quietly and very clearly, pack one bag, you and Millie. I'm driving you back to Ottawa today. Joe started to say something about the house, the lawyer, what Preston would. I called a lawyer this morning, Rosanna said. She works out of our firm, family law pro bono for situations like this. She can see you Monday. She'd been ready for this call before it came, Joe understood. She'd been ready for weeks. But we go today, Joe, not tomorrow. Millie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing her backpack. Rosanna looked at her niece. Millie looked back at her with the calm patience of a child who had already made up her mind and was waiting for the adults to catch up. Joe went upstairs and packed one bag. Preston's car was in the driveway when they came out. He was standing beside it with his arms crossed, and he looked at Joe and then at Rosanna and then at the bag in Joe's hand and at the backpack on Millie's shoulders, and something shifted in his face. Not grief, not regret, but the recalibration of someone realizing that a situation they expected to resolve itself on their terms was not going to. You are not taking her somewhere, he said. We're going to Ottawa. Joe kept walking. We'll be at Rosanna's. I don't think so. Preston. She stopped and looked at him, and what she meant to sound like was something firm, but what came out was much simpler than that. Exhaustion. Pure and uncomplicated. 11 years of it, compressing itself into one flat word. I'm going. He stood there and looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in a voice loud enough to carry to the houses on either side of Birchwood Drive, you drive out of this driveway right now. Don't expect to come back. Joe nodded at Rosanna. Rosanna reversed the car out of the driveway. They drove west out of Napanee and picked up the 401, and Joe watched the town go small in the passenger mirror and felt something release inside her chest. A tension held at a particular pitch. For so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Millie fell asleep in the back seat before they reached the first rest stop. Ottawa in February doesn't pretend to be anything it isn't. The cold is direct and the snow turns gray by midweek, and the wind off the river carries a frankness that Joe, after 11 years of trying to read what was coming, found unexpectedly easy to be around. The spare room in Rosanna's apartment on Lebreton Street had 2 beds pushed together and a window that looked out over the canal. Joe lay awake the first night listening to the radiator knock and to Millie breathing beside her, and she thought, the walls here are the right size. She couldn't explain it more precisely than that. For the first time in a very long time, the walls were the right size. She enrolled Millie in the school 2 blocks away. She applied for legal aid. She worked through the items on Rosanna's list, one at a time, steadily, the way she'd always worked through a difficult pattern, starting at the beginning, following the grain. And then, 3 weeks in, she went to the back of Rosanna's hallway closet and pulled out the machine she'd wrapped in 2 garbage bags and a moving blanket the night they left Napanee, and she set it up on the kitchen table. She had no commission, she had no plan, she sat down and began. Word travels through an apartment building the way it travels through a small town, quietly, door to door, carried along by the ordinary goodwill of people living near each other. By March, the woman on the 3rd floor had come down about a blazer that needed the shoulders adjusted. The retired professor on the 2nd floor had lost weight over the autumn and couldn't afford to replace her whole wardrobe. Rosanna's colleague from the firm needed a bridesmaid dress taken in before a May wedding. Joe charged what the work was worth, Not $20, not whatever seemed polite. Each time she wrote out an invoice, she thought, briefly, of the envelope in her coat pocket, and she charged what the work was worth. Rosanna's colleague asked, after the fitting, whether Joe took custom orders. Joe considered it for about 3 seconds and said yes. By April, the kitchen table wasn't enough. Rosanna came home one Tuesday evening to find Millie asleep on the couch under a bolt of turquoise cotton, and Joe on the floor with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, marking a pattern with Taylor's chalk, entirely absorbed. Rosanna stood in the doorway. Then she made tea for both of them and sat down on the floor beside her sister. The couple in 4B are moving out end of June, she said, setting a mug on the floor near Joe's knee. It's a small space, but it'd hold a table and 2 machines. Joe looked up. I'm not ready for. June isn't now, Rosanna said. You have time. In June, Josephine Warwick, she'd gone back to her maiden name quietly, the way you pick up something you'd only set down temporarily, rented the unit down the hall, and had a sign made for the door. She bought a second machine from a woman in Gloucester who was giving up quilting. By August, her waiting list was 6 weeks long. She heard through Callista, who texted occasionally now in a softer register, as if an apology were being continuously drafted and revised somewhere beneath her words, that Preston had sold the house on Birchwood Drive, that he was renting a place on the other side of Napanee, that Gertrude had had a fall and needed daily looking after, and the reality of what that involved was not going well for anyone. She heard that Paul Marchand, at some neighborhood gathering, had remarked simply that Joe had been the one holding that household together. Not dramatically, just as a fact, the way a neighborhood produces facts after it has had time to sit with something. She didn't feel triumphant when she heard these things. What she felt was quieter than that. The specific relief of realizing that a judgment she had been afraid of for years, the opinion of a town that had watched and said nothing, had stopped carrying any weight somewhere on the 401 between Napanee and Ottawa, in the dark, with Millie asleep in the back seat. In September, Millie started grade 5 at the new school. She made a best friend in the first week, a girl named Olive who had strong opinions about books and very little patience for people who pretended otherwise. Millie came home talking at a speed Joe hadn't heard since Millie was 5. Not the careful, measured way she'd spoken in the house on Birchwood Drive, where words had always been selected with the instinctive economy of a child who understood that the wrong sentence at the wrong moment cost something. She came home from this school loud and opinionated and full of Olive's theories about things, and Joe stood in the kitchen listening and felt something large and important settle inside her. The spring trip announcement came home in October. Montreal, April, 4 days, $220 plus spending money. Joe signed the permission form the same night it arrived. She wrote the check without checking the account first, without calculating, without rehearsing how she was going to ask someone else for the money. She sealed the envelope and put it in Millie's backpack for the morning and stood for a moment in the kitchen by herself. She had it without asking anyone. In October, a man from the 3rd floor knocked on the door of Unit 4B. His name was Bernard. His daughter was getting married in December and the bridesmaid alterations had fallen through. The seamstress had a family emergency, and the dresses were still unhemmed with 6 weeks to the wedding, and he'd been told by the woman on his floor whose blazer he'd noticed that Joe was the person to call. He stood in the doorway and said all of this in a rush, with the braced expression of someone who expects to be told it's too late, and has already started accepting that. Joe looked at her calendar. She looked at the work already booked. She asked him 3 questions about the dresses and the timeline and the fabrics. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He was easy to talk to in the way some people simply are. He listened when she explained things, asked the right questions, wrote down what she told him to write down. When they'd worked out the schedule and the pricing, he stood and shook her hand with both of his, which was something her father used to do when he meant it. "I'll invoice you on delivery," Joe said, "full rate." He looked at her as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing to say, which it was. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you think is fair." She watched him walk back down the hall toward the elevator. Then she turned back to the unit, to the machine, and the commission log, and the colors she'd chosen herself, and she picked up where she'd left off. On a Thursday morning in January, 13 months after she'd packed one bag and walked out to Rosanna's car, Josephine Warwick sat at the machine, in Unit 4B with her coffee, and a commission log with a 6-week wait. The light through the window was the particular flat gray of a Canadian January, The kind of light that makes the world look like it's holding its breath before something begins. She was 35 years old. She had her name on the door, and work she'd built with her own hands, and a daughter who came home loud, and a sister who had known before she did what she was capable of. In the bottom of her bag, folded flat, was the carbon copy of the check she'd written for Millie's Montreal trip. $220, written out by herself, from her own account without hesitation. She had not gone crawling back. There was a client coming at 10. A woman who bought that dress in a Boxing Day sale that was 2 sizes too large and needed it reimagined from the seams up. Jo had been thinking about the construction all week, turning it over in the back of her mind the way you think about a problem you're genuinely looking forward to solving. She took a sip of her coffee, opened the file, and began.